Hello, guys. Today we are at another episode, but rather than being a micro question, today we are looking at a macro question, globalization topic. Okay, so this is another topic that students like to avoid because it is tend to be quite broad, and the coverage of the content also tend to be quite wide. So something like how students for micro they will avoid firms and decision market failure. So for macro, a lot of students will avoid globalization also because it tends to be quite contextualized. However, I will advise against skipping this topic because for your macro essay, globalization is increasingly common. So even if you could avoid it in your paper 2 essays, 15 mark, 10 mark, for example, you still have to cover the content in your CSQ. Actually, if you look at the content itself, globalization is actually not that tough, although the content can be quite heavy, but there will be a structure which if you follow, you will be able to retain the content better. So before we even go to the question, let's do some recap of the globalization content. So for globalization, the content is heavy, but it is mainly broken down into 3 sections. So firstly, they will talk about why trade, because globalization is about going beyond the domestic boundary to interact with other countries. So in order to understand why countries even bother to interact, we need to understand the nature of globalization. So usually you start from trade because trade is the most primitive, most practical reasons countries start to interact with each other. So when the notes talk about why trade, they will cover the content of comparative advantage. So comparative advantage, when we recap about the definition, this is when a country is able to produce a certain good and service at the lowest opportunity cost. So this means that countries which has the lowest opportunity cost in producing this good has a comparative advantage, and therefore this country should be the one who produced it and specialize in it, and all other countries should then buy from this country, buy by other country. Because if this country has the lowest comparative advantage, if the country has comparative advantage, meaning that the lowest opportunity cost, right, also means that this country is the most efficient in producing this good. So by logic, the country should specialize in this good, and this country can choose to segment the production of this product in a few ways. Firstly, they can keep some for their own country's consumption. And second, any excess amount that is not consumed domestically, they can choose to export. And other countries who also require this good, they should not specialize in this because they do not have comparative advantage. So this is also why countries start to open their border, because they are specializing, they are exporting. So globalization starts from this idea of trade, of comparative advantage, and then after that they further branch into 2 other reasons why countries globalize. Second is about the capital flow, because countries over time, they know that they cannot just rely on themselves for survival, because a country has limited resources, limited endowment. So they need to open themselves to trade, first to access greater goods and services, to be able to consume things that they don't specialize production in, and then they import, and then they can also export their specialty so that they earn your your export revenue. And then the second reason is the capital flow, because capital flow will come in the form of money, assets, FDI, hot money, things like that, where a country will need resources from other country to, say, grow a certain sector, get certain resources, or a country has plans to expand its business operations in other country because they see an opportunity of a new market, access to resources. So this opening up of border also allows this capital flow to move around, is in terms of the investment, because when you learn about your investment, you learn it in your aggregate demand, right? But there is actually foreign forms of investment through your capital flow. The most common one would be your FDI that you hear a lot. Hot money is yes lah, but not that often, because hot money is more opportunistic, but FDI is more planned, more long term, more sustainable. So capital flow is the second reason why countries open themselves up. And the third reason is your labor flow, because again, labor is a form of resources, right? So sometimes a country, they may want to reduce their cost of production because perhaps locally their workforce is more expensive. For example, Singapore, because a lot of the population are quite educated, so they demand a higher pay. So countries who want to lower their cost of production, they will then look for more affordable labor from other country to lower their labor cost and then bring this labor in. So you have labor moving around, your workers who demand a lower pay, and then this helps to reduce cost of production for the country. And another perspective is the movement of talents, because talents, perhaps they feel that their home country cannot give them the work opportunity that they look for, so they want to move overseas to progress themselves. So movement of talent as well. So talent can come in, talent can come out across country. So this facilitates your labor flow. So actually for globalization, a lot of the content will evolve around these three aspects. So long you can link your answers to these three areas. So firstly, your trade, and secondly, your capital flow, and third, your labor flow. This should be able to help you answer, say, at least 70% of the time of your globalization question. Because a lot of students, when they think of globalization, they feel that the content is so heavy, I can link to everything. It is true, because ultimately all this content that you see here, right, they sort of can link to your greater picture of your macro goal. So we learn about your macro goal, your 4 macro goal, right? Your economic growth, your inflation, unemployment, balance of payment. So here, if we look at these three main areas of globalization, you see that they are quite related. So for example, the trade is about your X minus M, which is your balance of trade. Your capital flow is a part of your balance of payment. Okay, here is your BOT. This is your BOP. And labor flow will relate to things like your SRAS, because this is about your cost of production, and also your LRAS. So you see that how these three aspects affects your AS, your AD respectively, and this can then affect your attainment of macro goal. But if you come across a globalization question and you are stuck, always just think of these three aspects: trade, capital flow, and labor flow, and then use this to either, according to the question, link to, say, benefits and costs to the economy through affecting the macro goal, and perhaps also how countries can be better being globalized to achieve what. So these could be things that you talk about. But here, the question is also applicable to these three areas. We look at the question and we see how it is related. Okay, so I will erase this part first. This is just meant for a quick recap. So I would say actually globalization is a very good topic because it has a nice flow to the macro econ story. So at first you start from domestic, right? You learn about things like your circular flow of income, you learn about ADAS, you learn about your standard of living, you learn about your macro goal, which are largely domestic. It is accept your BOT, BOP, and your policy like your exchange rate policy that starts to branch out beyond the domestic part. You go external. So globalization is a huge part of the external, yet it is still able to link back to the domestic aspect, looking at the country holistically, because a country you don't just stay domestic, right? Most countries around the world are already going global, varying in extent. So this is a good area to look into and is really relevant today, increasingly relevant perhaps. So for example, Singapore. You see that for Singapore, our AD has the typical structure, right? CIGX minus M. And you learn that for Singapore, actually the trade aspect, X minus M, forms the largest part of our aggregate demand. So this means that Singapore is very reliant on trade, very globalized. So this is an example of how a country can be very reliant on globalization, hence increasing the importance of this topic. And it can be quite interesting because you can link to almost everything that you have learned before in your macro. Yep. So as we see more question types of globalization, then we can link back. And this I feel is also a good recap because it talks about a lot of the content you have learned, right? So it sort of sums up nicely the whole story. Yep. Okay, so let's look at the question. This is again, we are looking at a 15-mark question. So for our videos, because now we are crawling quite close to your final exam, to your promo in J1, your A-level in J2. So we try to really cover the critical parts first, which are your essay evaluation question, because they tend to be more challenging. So we do that first. Subsequently, when we have time, we will also cover the 10-mark types and even your content. Yep. So stay tuned. Okay, so let's go to the question. So the preamble is quite short. This is a past year A-level question, but some time back. But the content is still quite relevant to the today's context. So let's take a look. Okay, so the preamble says we are structuring to become more competitive, not less. So this is a statement by the Minister of Singapore of the Ministry of Trade and Industry. So MTI is a ministry that looks at businesses, look at Singapore internal, external trade, relation, investment, things like that. So very economic facing. Yep. So it's under their purview. Okay, so Singapore, we know it is a very small country, yet it is very reliant on external relations with other country, trade and stuff. So the question B asks, assess. Okay, so again, we need to look at the keyword, the action word of a eval question. Assess the measures adopted by the Singapore government to improve its global competitiveness. Okay, so how do we even approach this question? So we highlight the key terms here. So we have measures. So measures, usually it refers to your policies, because this is a measure by the government. So actions by the government is typically a policy. So assess the policies that the Singapore government, so here is very important because of the Singapore context. So your answer, your policy needs to be contextualized to Singapore. Okay, this usually might drive students away because students are very scared of giving example. But actually, if you think of it, right, if you focus on studying the Singapore economy traits and characteristics, they are quite fixed because they are facts, right? They are facts that have happened, are happening. So actually, if you just spend some time, or even you ask ChatGPT to give you some Singapore traits relating to your econ syllabus, you remember a few of them, it is worthwhile to study, because for globalization question, it can be quite frequently tested on the Singapore context. Okay, to improve its global competitiveness. Okay, so if we are asked to assess this, it will imply that we need to answer, is this effective or not? Because when you are asked to assess a policy to achieve, say, an outcome A, right? When you assess, it will mean, is it successful, is it effective, and stuff, and why do you think so? So in this case, because this is a 15 mark, I would suggest we can have minimum 3 policy. Then we can compare the policy to see are they effective or not. Because when the question talks about the word assess is a very broad term. It can be talk about 3 policy and then determine are they effective. Or you can even compare. You can compare 3 policy and see which is the most effective. But in this case, I think we can go with the first case, which is whether it is effective or not, because this would be more easy to manage. So the structure, usually before we do even write the points, right, we must have a broad structure. The structure will be assess 3 policies and explain, are they effective to increase global competitiveness? Whether improve or increase is about the same lah, huh? But here you realize that we need to do something else. What is it? Okay, so the answer is we have to unpack. What do you mean by global competitiveness? What do you mean when you are global competitive? So this is some of the more challenging aspects of your essay question, because sometimes the question asks certain thing, but you realize that you don't really unpack it very well. So if you don't unpack it very well, then of course your answer is going to be unclear, right? Because your outcome, you are not very sure what's the outcome. So here in this case, the global competitiveness is the outcome. And then how do we show that a country is globally competitive in terms of what? So here now, just now our content will come into play, right? Because we talk about 3 areas. So we talk about trade, we talk about our capital flow, and then we talk about our labor. So here, you realize that a lot of students, when they look at their globalization questions, they tend to only remember the trade part, because you already are being familiarized with trade since your macro goal, your BOP, BOT, and even your exchange rate policy. You have been framed your mind to talk about X minus M, X minus M. So when the globalization content talks about all these other things like capital flow and labor, right, it sort of doesn't register as clearly in the student's mind. So if you think about it, if you just talk about trade in this question, 15 mark, your answer is going to be very thin, because trade, you cannot talk a lot, right? You only can talk a lot about its role as a exporter globally. So Singapore could be a very attractive exporter. A lot of people want to trade with Singapore. But your answer is very thin because you are only focusing on one area. So do always recall these 3 areas. If you want to remember just one thing about globalization, remember these 3 areas, because these 3 areas actually can make you recall and uncover a lot more content. Yeah. Okay, so what does it mean when I want to be globally competitive in trade, in capital flow, and in labor? So we need to help the examiner unpack what do we mean. Because ultimately, when you know what you want to be in these 3 areas, then the policy will be very sharp, right? Very direct. For example, Singapore, you want to be a top exporter, because Singapore, we rely a lot on our export revenue for growth. So if we want to be globally competitive, we want to be the top exporter. So top exporter will mean that a lot of countries want to trade with you. They want to buy your product from you so that you earn more export revenue. But how do you become competitive? So here we unpack further because this is the role, right? But what aspect of trade do you want to be competitive in? So you can talk about, if I want to be a top exporter in the world, I need to have price competitive products. So this means that my price is not say cheap lah, but value for money, affordable. So you can write value for money. And also quality competitive. So here what I'm doing is I don't just tell you, say, okay, I want to be the winner of this competition. In order to be the winner of this competition, what do I need to do? What do I need to achieve? And then later you work backwards to then come up with some measures that you can say. So you can minimally say one measure by the Singapore government to achieve that. Okay, because when you do that, it will be very clear what you want to be your outcome. Okay, capital flow. So how do you want to be globally competitive in terms of capital flow? So of course, capital flow is a good thing, right? Because it's an asset, it means resources, it means knowledge, technology, innovation that could come in, and also opening you up to more business opportunity. So here you can say that you want to be a top choice for FDI. So among the very rich, the ultra rich global investor, right? You want to be on top of their mind when they think of, if I have a $10 billion, which market should I invest in? So maybe they can be from US, they can be from China, India. So they want to think of Singapore as the first country that they want to set up in. So how do you be a top choice for FDI? You should be pro-enterprise, right? Because when firms from overseas, they want to come into a country, they will want the process to be smooth. They want to make sure that their businesses can earn money. So you can be pro-enterprise by government support, perhaps. Or you can make sure that you welcome these investors, foreign investors in by giving them a lot of things like infrastructure. Okay, I'm going a little bit to the policy already, but these are just some example what would make you globally attractive, globally competitive from the FDI aspect. Okay, then the second one is that you have a lot of business opportunity. So you will want the market to have good sentiments. You want the market to have a lot of consumers, a lot of potential in earnings, things like that. Okay, then the third one, labor. How do you be globally competitive? So if you are a country who is globally competitive in labor, it will mean that labor will want to go to your country, right? So you want to come to Singapore. Okay, it's a little squeezy. Later I'll adjust the space a little bit. If you want to go to Singapore, it means that you want to be an attractive country for workers to work in. So you can talk about, I have worker benefits, or perhaps I have a very competitive salary. Because workers wouldn't want to go to a country that pay very low, right? So worker benefit, salary is good. Yeah. So you paint out for the examiner, what do you envision a globally competitive country to be in these three aspects? And then once you have that, then your policy will be very targeted at those. And then your evaluation, because you want to assess the policy, right? So you can talk about your eval to look at this policy and see in the Singapore context, can they be implemented for a long term? Are they really able to achieve these goals? So these are things that you can talk about in your answer later. Okay, so the first part now, the pink one, is the role. How do you look like when you are globally competitive? The next part would be the measure that the government do, right? So because this is a 15 mark and we have time constraint, we cannot write everything we know. We only can choose one. So let's choose one for each aspect. Okay, so the first one, in order to be price and quality competitive, you can say that the Singapore government continuously builds comparative advantage. So now we link to our comparative advantage content. We don't just say, oh, we want to make our export but link to previous concepts as you can, because now the examiner will know that, oh, you are really quite strong in this content because you are able to link to like earlier parts which are relevant. So the Singapore government continuously strengthens its comparative advantage. Because when you have a comparative advantage, it means you are already efficient in production. So this can imply that you are able to reduce cost of production and then be price competitive, because lower COP means lower prices because you pass the cost savings to your consumer. And also with, say, coupled with innovation, coupled with the use of technology, you can ensure that your quality is also there. So Singapore government continuously strengthens its comparative advantage to ensure its exports are value for money and high quality. So how do you do that? You can do that by investing in your R&D. R&D is a great way to find out new potential, new area. Then we continuously also move up the value chain creation, because last time when we learn about the Singapore's history of your comparative advantage, we were from a very labor intensive sector, so agriculture. Then we move on to the capital intensive sector, your factory, your industrialization. Then now we move on to even higher value add technology, online services, your pharmaceutical, things like that. So they are also exports that can fetch more money for Singapore. So Singapore continuously do that, and then ensure that is a globally competitive exporter. So you can explain how the Singapore government does that. So you can see that we will always be creating products that bring value. So you give some example to say pharmaceutical. Some I will write in short form because lack of space. Okay, but we move on. Okay, so for capital flow, how does the Singapore government ensure that Singapore is an attractive country for investment? So firstly, the government, they are very supportive of companies coming to set up. So there are a lot of grants given. So these grants will also help the companies to settle in, because setting up a country overseas can be very tedious, because you need to clear a lot of regulation, you need a lot of capital. So the Singapore government provide things such as grants. Sometimes they will even relax certain regulations, or they will reduce corporate tax, because corporate tax means that the firms need to give a portion of their profits to the government when the tax is due for payment. But for some companies, the government will reduce corporate tax so that these companies are more enticed to set up in Singapore. So with that, then the other foreign investors will feel that Singapore is a worthwhile place to invest in, because not only do we have a very positive business sentiment, we also have a lot of support for them to set up seamlessly. Yep. Okay. Anything else we can talk about the capital flow? Anything that can improve business sentiment? Yeah, I think this is fine because actually, thinking of it, business sentiment is a little hard to adjust lah because it also depends on economic growth of the country, right? So if you have a global downturn, generally FDI they are also less reluctant to move around because they are not sure of how a country is doing. So if the country has a relatively healthy economic growth, then this also means that there are increased consumerism, increased investment. Okay, maybe another one would be you making the loans easier because when businesses set up in say domestic or overseas, right, they need capital. Sometimes they will need to borrow from the bank. So the bank will make the loan easier for them, maybe lower interest rate. So we reduce the cost of borrowing, right? Then this will increase your investment. Yeah. So besides talking about how this policy function, you need to focus on how they achieve the goal of Singapore being competitive in. So for example, we talk about the comparative advantage, right? Singapore government continuously grows our CA to improve our product quality, price competitiveness through using R&D and create higher value chain goods. So this will make Singapore an attractive exporter. And then for the attracting FDI into Singapore, how the government supports businesses, how they make resources more easily available to the investor. So then this will lead to them wanting to come to Singapore as investor because it is easier for them to set up, easier for them to stabilize, start the business, and also more opportunities for them to succeed. Okay, then the third one, how does Singapore help to facilitate the movement of labor into Singapore? So especially for your foreign talent, they call it the expats, right? The expats are the global talent that come to Singapore to work. So you usually have support for expats, such as living expenses, certain housing benefits, etc. And then support through living expenses. Yeah, even for some expats who want to come to Singapore long term and get citizenship, they are able to do that. Because if Singapore feels that they are value adding to the country and then is a valuable worker, then they will be granted citizenship. So these are things that are quite Singapore specific. Okay, so now that we have come to talk about what it means for Singapore to be globally competitive in these three areas, how it looks like, and then talking about how the policy works. Now we need to come to the eval part because we haven't really evaluate, right? We were just setting up the stage for the policy, the global competitiveness, how it looks like. Now we look at the evaluation part. So the evaluation part, you can talk about telling the examiner that you are going to determine if it's effective. So how do you determine if a policy is effective? So we have talked about it in our earlier essay practice. When we say effective, we can talk about, say, 2 parameters. Okay, we don't go too deep because we still have to talk about how each is effective or not. So firstly, you can talk about, is it a short-term or long-term measure? Of course, if you want something to be sustainable, effective, you want it to be long-term. So we can look at these 3 policies to see how is it able to be implemented long term or not. So in terms of that, you can say, are there enough resources? Can this policy be sustainable, for example. And the second one is whether it is implementable or not. So sometimes policies can be mentioned, they can be sounding very good conceptually, but you need to determine if it can be implemented. Meaning that on the ground, is it easy to effect? Does it take forever to take effect? So if it doesn't use too much resources or too logistically troublesome to implement, then it is considerably implementable. So a good policy in this question, they should score quite well in whether it can be implemented long run or not, or implementable. So here we can try to, because these are the policy that we say, right? So we can try to argue that these three policies are actually long term and also implementable. So I think at this point, students might struggle to finish the question because you might not have time. So in order to ensure that you have an eval, right, you can do this quite quickly. So you say how you are going to determine if it's effective, long run, implementable, and you talk about how each of them can be implementable and long term. So in terms of the comparative advantage part, you can give example of how this has already been implemented for decades since Singapore independence, since 1965. So you can say how the Singapore government has been continuously doing that, and Singapore is now one of the more globally popular trade partner. So you can say that Singapore, because of this, we have many trade partner, because in our trading portfolio, our trade portfolio is very diversified. So when we talk about diversification, it also means that a lot of countries want to trade with us. They trust us, right? That's why they trade with us. So I'll write this quickly here. Okay, I'll erase a little bit because it's a bit no space. But here we can talk about how Singapore has a diversified portfolio. So diversified portfolio means we have many trade partners. So the fact that we can do that for decades and we have many trade partners, it means that it is implementable, right? Because it has been successful in implementation. And then it is long term because it has been like that since 1965. So these are a very quick way that you can say is effective. You can show how history has shown that this has been done for a long time and continue to do so today. So this means that it is implementable and pretty long term because it has been decades. So it passes the two parameter to be effective. Then for capital flow, this is also very common as well. So you can say how the government, the sector has many agencies being set up to support businesses. So you can say, for example, your MTI, your ESG, Enterprise Singapore. So you can talk about they have a lot of business grants for these companies and other initiatives that support FDI. So you can also give some statistics of what is happening in the Singapore business market. So you can cite some MNC that has been in Singapore. For example, you can talk about, say, any maybe 2 or 3 sector that you like. You show that Singapore economy is not just being made up of domestic firms, but also MNCs as well. So the fact that we have a lot of MNCs, although we are a small country, it means that we are also globally competitive in terms of FDI. So if you want to talk about contextualized example, should I talk about what has been happened already? So you can have a substantial information. Try not to talk about what is currently, say, still at the infant stage or haven't been implemented, because you don't have results to show. So if you want to show something has been successful in certain areas, show what has been done. Yep. So in terms of this, these agencies were also set up for a long term and also how the MNC scene continues to be quite robust in Singapore economy. So this also passes the two criteria of long-term and implementable. Yep. Then for the third one as well, you can say you can cite some statistics of the percentage of Singaporeans that are foreigner, and you can also talk about how now today you have a lot of expats living among us, and how your foreign labor can come into Singapore freely, easily, without constraints, quickly. Yeah. And today, per the two previous evaluation point, how today we have a lot of expats living among us. Okay, maybe not only expats but also your other foreign worker, like your blue collar workers. A lot of them, when you see, for example, in your, okay, so you can give examples where you see a lot of a mixture of foreign and local workers. So for example, your F&B, your hospitality, a lot of foreign workers. So this shows how easily it is and attractive Singapore is as a country for them to come. So you can say this is increasingly a scene in Singapore. So you also show that this is a long-term and implementable measure. Yep. So with that, if with the very short time you have, at least keep it, say, because for paper 2 you have 45 minutes for each part A and part B. So say if your time allocation is quite good, actually 25 minutes for your 15 mark is good enough time, so you can try to write as much as you can for this question. So you can see actually this question we spend quite some time, because you need quite a lot of time to unpack what it means, what you can write, and then what you can evaluate. So we have achieved that here. We talk about what does it mean to be globally competitive in terms of what, how does it look like, and then what are the measures today that is to support this, and then how do you tell if they are effective? Because we say assess, right? So we try to say how effective they are, and we use these two parameters and we run through them to show that yes, today this has been achieved using this policy. So this is good enough because you included eval, you included very clear definition and outcome, and the policies are already in place today. So this should be quite good enough for the time that you have. Yeah. Okay, so yes, because today's video is a little long, so I will keep the closing sentences shorter. So moving forward, we will also pick a few more macro essay to look at them. Maybe we can focus on the macro goal policies ones, because they are the big sections of content. So we will try to do that, and then stay tuned for the upcoming videos, and hopefully you can use this video to help you do your revision. Okay, see you at the next video. Bye bye.